Hello and welcome to this video. This time we are trying to make an copper NMM, and I painted this on this Crozius Arcanum from one of the older Chaplain models I had laying around, and I thought this would be a very good part to try out some copper with this NMM style. The colors I used for this were Mournfang Brown, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Fleshtone, Kislev Flesh, and White. All colors from Citadel except the white. This was from AK Interactive 3rd generation. So I start off by painting the most prominent areas with Mournfang Brown. Depending on how much or how you want the copper to look in the end, I would advise to paint more of the Mournfang Brown and paint it way more opaque than I did. Because you will see it in the end, or did already see it on the thumbnail. My version of copper is very pale. It kind of looks like a very desaturated copper, which may very well be the effect you want to have. But if you want a more rich copper, you should try to start with a more opaque brown and maybe substitute one of the colors with a more orange color. But I think just painting the Mournfang Brown or brown in general more opaque would help a lot with getting a more red, more rich copper. As I said, I started off with blocking in the main light reflection points. As always, I use very thin down paints, about 50-50, and the more white in the paint is, the more thinned down the paint gets. There are more reasons for me to do this, but you can of course try to paint with thicker paints, but I find it more easy to paint over details and get this effect and the blending in later stages much easier with this consistency. You can see when I or how the consistency of the paint is when I rub it on my thumb. It's quite translucent, and so you just need to paint a few more layers than you would have to with slightly thicker paint. The effect you get is that there's already some kind of transition from the black to the brown. As I said, if you want your copper to look a bit more rich, I would advise to maybe either use more layers of this paint when painting with this consistency, or to just use a bit more opaque consistency, thicker consistency, to get a more opaque layer. That said, if you want to have this a bit more higher contrast, just do as I do, and I think it looks very cool in the end, although I did not anticipate it to look that way while I was painting. Yeah, I want to excuse myself up front. There will be some scenes where you see me painting out of the frame. I'm still working on setting up the camera the best way, and from time to time you will see me not being perfectly in frame, because I was so heavily zoomed in to show off all the details and every stroke of the brush, that it was very hard for me to keep the miniature, or this part of the miniature, always in the frame. So I'm very sorry if there's something missing you were interested in, but I think there's enough footage to show the most interesting and important parts of this process, so that you would be able to recreate it on any kind of model you want to. Okay, so this next step is going over to the Bugman's Glow. With this color you will get some more of the red or red-brown tones in the lighter areas, or in the highlight areas. I try to be somewhat neat at this stage, and to do the parts with Bugman's Glow already in a bit smaller manner than I did before with the Mournfang Brown, to get somewhat of a transition already. But to be honest, it's not that important at this stage, because we will paint over with the Mournfang Brown, and even with the Bugman's Glow over the rest we are doing. As I mentioned in one of the other videos already, that is one of the reasons why I like to paint with thinned downs, very thinned down paints, because I find it easier to repair mistakes, and to blend the colors together on later stages. The downside of painting with such thin down paints is, as you can see, if you do not rub the paint off enough your brush, you will sometimes get somewhat of the pooling effect, especially in these very, very, very tiny areas where there's so much fine detail that even such a small brush as I use is kind of too big for getting right where you need it. There are definitely pages that have greater brush control than I have, most definitely. But the downside also is somewhat of an upside, because it actually doesn't matter that much. Just let the paint dry where it is, and as soon as it dries, it's so thin that you actually just have somewhat of a coloration, but not a very thick and opaque layer of paint. So if you did a mistake, it will be very easy to repair it. Okay, at this stage I will get back in with the Mournfang Brown, because as I already said, I saw that there was too much black in these areas, and you can always get back in with the first highlight color or main highlight color to kind of reinforce the areas and give back some coloration to them to make them look more rich in color and more saturated. I think you can already see that this technique kind of has an effect already. And especially on the skull, on the upper part of the skull, it already looks very shiny. what is somewhat important with paints that are as thin as the ones I use is to push the brush more into the area where you want to have the most opaque part. So into your highlight area, because when you push with your brush and lift the brush up from the miniature or the model, the area where you lift the brush up is where most of the paint will gather. So this is the point where the paint will be most opaque. Okay, I think now we are up to Cadian Fleshtone. As before, you just paint this in where you did before with the Bugman's Glow, but try to be a bit more neat and smaller when applying this, because this will be the first major light reflection or highlight color. Everything we did before was for more for the coloration, and this is where you get more of the polished look and the real high contrast light reflection, because in comparison to Bugman's Glow, Cadian Fleshtone is already a very light color and has a way higher part of white in it. This is also the first stage where you should notice if what you're doing is right, because when you're finished with applying the first 1 or 2 layers of the Cadian Fleshtone, there should be a visible effect in terms of the part you painted should look already a bit shiny, or shinier than before. So as you can see, it's kind of important for this effect to work, especially on very detailed areas, that you start edge highlighting some parts. You don't have to paint every edge or line, but it helps with creating this effect and defining the geometry of the parts you're painting. So I personally prefer to do it that way, but it's not a must. Okay, the next part is with Kislev Flash. You will see me jumping around between all these colors from time to time, just to get in the first kind of blends, and also, as before mentioned, to resaturate the parts where I get way too light in color. On the upper left part of the wet palette, you see the mixture of Kislev Flash and white. You could also use maybe just a lighter version of a skin tone than Kislev Flash, or what also would be possible is to use ice yellow, either pure for a bit more extreme shine or extreme highlight, or by mixing it with the Kislev Flash. It's always when painting metallic surfaces, whether you are painting with this non-metallic metal technique or with true metallics, it's important to overemphasize or emphasize the areas where light should and would collect the most, yeah, the lightest almost. So I find even when painting with true metallics, which I don't do as often, to be honest, you should also try to highlight these areas with a lighter metallic color. Basically, in my opinion, it's painting good NMM and TMM doesn't differ that much from each other. I think the style and also the result look the best when you paint them kind of similar. Also, what you probably saw is that my brush was not the best or had the sharpest point at this stage. Maybe try to use a newer brush with a better tip, especially when going into the highlight or light color stages. Now we're up to the mixture of Kislev Flesh and White. And as again, or again as said before, we are concentrating on the lightest parts and just try to apply this color a bit more careful, a bit more neat, and when going over highlights you painted in before, just try to be a bit more narrow in application, and so that there's a visible transition between the colors, and some of the colors you painted in before are still visible. Whenever you see that you over highlighted an area, or that you think that you went too far, too bright, or too big, just take the step before and paint over it. It will not only help to tone down the lighter colors and give them more saturation, but it will also, funnily enough, help and create a more shiny effect. Yeah, that's one of the shots where you're not able to see anything I paint, but trust me, it's not that important. Yeah, now you can see again, and pretty much at this stage you just fiddle between the colors and maybe try to bring some saturation back into the areas that went too light or too dark, and it's somewhat more of the creative part of painting this kind of stuff, um, to the point where you just decide if you want more contrast, more saturation, and you kind of decide where the overall look um, of the metal you're painting is heading. Okay, now you see me add a bit more white to the palette, and I'll take a bit of the mixture I had before of Kislev flesh with white, and mix it. You don't have to be precise on the mixtures. Just look that maybe the jumps are not too extreme, or if you go heavily into white, you could also add pure white as a final highlight. Just be conscious what you're doing, and try to apply it very sparingly. Okay. Now we get to a kind of interesting part. I use a bit of the already very thin Mournfang brown, and add about 2 parts water to the paint to dilute it even further into a glaze. And now with the glazing we're doing two, or you see me later do a third very important thing. First we already establish somewhat of color transition or blend by pushing the very, very, very thinned down paint from the highlight into the shadow areas. That's helping with transitioning the lighter colors into the darker shadow areas. And the other effect you will see is that we bring a bit more of the brown tone back into the lighter areas. Just try not to apply it directly over the very light colors, because it may dry right over them and create somewhat of a coffee stain effect. Although I would say on something that small and detailed, you will probably not get much of this effect, especially when you apply it very, very lightly. Make sure to rub down most of the paint from the brush into a piece of kitchen roll, and check the consistency on your fingernail or on your skin to see if it is really translucent enough. Because one of the mistakes when I started painting that I did with glazing is that I mostly had way too much paint in the brush, and then it starts pooling and drying very inconsistently, and it just looks messy. Also, try to let the layers you painted dry completely, and do not go over them until they are dried completely, because you may rip the paint from where you just painted it in, and that's something that you won't be able to fix that easily. You can create small light spots with your highlight color, just to make it look like there are impurities or dents and imperfections in the metal. Also on armor, shields, swords, and similar stuff, it also would look pretty cool if you have chips or scratches in them. It sounds a bit strange at first, but in my opinion, this really helps with selling the effect of a metal area. Also, what would be possible if you, for example, paint something like the trim or weapons for a Death Guard army, for example, or a Nurgle Chaos Warrior army. It would look very cool if you add verdigris to the copper. I did something similar to that to the bronze trim of Mortarion when I painted him. And if you apply it in a somewhat neat and or I'd rather say conscious style and manner, you get a very, very cool effect that adds more interest to these kind of areas. Of course, it's always a bit counterintuitive to paint something to your absolute best and then start painting over it with a completely different color. For example, for verdigris, you can use blue or green colors, and yeah, at first it feels kind of bad if you start doing it, but in the end, the effect will look very, very cool. And yeah, if you're interested in seeing how I did it or would approach something like that, make sure to leave a comment and let me know. And maybe I could even use this piece and add some verdigris on some parts. And yeah, then you can decide if you think it looks cool or if you'd rather not do it. That said, on a of course on a loyal Space Marine armor, it does not make that much sense lore-wise to paint in verdigris or some some other extreme weathering, since most of them would get their armor and gear maintenance pretty regularly by chapter serfs, or would even do it themselves. So, but as always with painting, and especially on fantasy and sci-fi models, I prefer to stick to the rule of cool and not to be firmly on what the lore provides us. Okay, now I got back to the glaze of Mournfang Brown, and what I do now is somewhat of a pin washing technique. I do that to reinforce the parts where you have a transition from one part to another, just to reinforce the shadows back again. Because, as mentioned before, when you paint with such a thin down consistency, you always will have paint run into the recesses of areas where you didn't want paint to go. On one side, it helps to kind of add paint in areas where you normally wouldn't put it, and funnily enough, this helps to kind of sell the non-metallic metal effect or metal effect. On the other hand, when you lose separation between parts of the miniature, you get somewhat of a unclean effect, and so it always makes sense to get back into these areas and neaten them up. You could also use a wash for that, or what works really, really good are oil washes, because they run into the recesses more easily than acrylic glazes or washes, but it's something that you have to try out, and just don't put the wash all over the area you painted, because then you will have again the problem that on the very, very light highlight areas you will get somewhat of a coffee stain effect. And also the transitions or you worked out when you painted it get somewhat more transitioned over, and so you lose a bit of that shine and step into the higher contrast areas. Yeah, okay. We're to the end of the video now, and I know it was very long, and but I really wanted to show how I painted this part of the miniature in very much detail. I hope you still enjoyed it, and as I said, I would like to see some suggestions of you, what you want to see me paint next. Of course, I will still work on Helbrecht and keep updating the video series on him. If you're interested in seeing anything else, just leave a comment, and I will try to come up with something. Okay, thank you for watching, and see you next time.